Hello everyone and welcome to the second My Carbon Zero tutorial. I'm Sam Ashworth and I'll be taking you through how to create your own carbon balance sheet today. So underneath this video you should find an Excel file to download and it should look something like this. So I'm going to quickly explain this to you. On the left here we've got our liabilities, which is made up of our emissions throughout our life. So we're going to fill this in using the data that we made in the first tutorial of our yearly emissions from the countries that we've lived in. On the right here we've got our assets with R1, R2 and R3 actions, which we're going to fill in, and these are things that we do to reduce or remove our carbon emissions. So if you've seen our videos about this, it really helps you to understand what each of these are and which things you're doing to reduce fall into which categories and so on and so forth. So I recommend you go watch that before you fill this out. And then I also recommend that you write yourself a list of the things that you've done to reduce your emissions, all the things you'd like to do in the future, and have a look on our website or online to find out how much that would reduce your emissions by. Okay. So, and on the right here we've got the final numbers, which you don't touch at all. That fills it in by itself. And there's a graph which shows your lifetime emissions. So I'm going to go ahead and open this file from the other tutorial over here, where we've calculated the yearly emissions for Scott Poynton, our founder. And I'm going to continue using his example as a way to demonstrate how you would do this yourself. Okay. So I'll drag this over to put it next to your carbon balance sheet here. And this column here on the right is the only column that we're actually going to fill out to start off with our yearly emissions. What we do is we come over here to this part of our emissions data from the first tutorial. We're going to use these yearly figures over here and fill it in from the date he was born and as he goes along, where he's been living, how much the emissions are worth. Okay, so he was born in 1964 in Australia. So we're going to start with this figure over here on top. As you can see, Australia's on the top. And we're going to start here with 20.256. We're going to round it up to 20.26, okay? And I'm going to start down here and input that there. Okay, now we lived there until 1990, so I'm going to go ahead and use this Excel feature where you grab the right hand side of the cell and you just drag it up like that to 1990. Okay, I'll zoom in so you can see that a bit better. So after that, he moved to the UK for a year in 1991. So I think the UK is the second on our list here, with emissions of 6.78. Okay, so I'm going to go and write this down here, 6.78, and that's it, it's only for a year. He moved back to Australia for 2 years, so we're going to use the same figures before, 20.26, and move this up another year. Okay. Now we get to 1994, where he moved to Vietnam for 2 years. I believe this is the third on our list here, with 2.59 for the emissions. Okay, and that's for 2 years. So we'll move that to 1995. And this should be a lot easier for you, as most people don't move around this much. They live in 1 or 2 countries. And it's much easier to calculate or to add into this. You'll just be able to drag in the whole way. Okay, in 1996, we moved back to Australia for 2 years, so we've got 20.26 as from below, and up to 1997. Then he moved back to the UK for 2 years, so that's 6.78 from down here. 6.78, and that's until 1999. And then from that, in 2000, he moved to Vietnam for another 4 years. So we're going to grab the figure from Vietnam down here and type it in up here, 2.59. And that goes until 2003. Okay. And then finally, he moved to Switzerland in 2004. And then we've got the Swiss data here is 5.18 for the emissions. And I'm going to go ahead and drag that until the present day. Okay, so you can see things happening on the right here. You don't need to worry about that yet. All we're doing is that we're putting in our estimated emissions yearly for our whole life. And you'll see the total at the end should be the same or very similar to what you had before over here. And actually, this is going to help. It's just an estimate down here, but this is going to help you visualize how it goes ahead and how your reductions in emissions actually affect your yearly emissions. So that's the first step of creating your carbon balance sheet. We'll go on to the step of the assets next. Okay, so in the second part of the carbon balance sheet video, we're going to talk about the assets with the R1, R2, and R3 actions. I'm still going to use the example of Scott Poynton and show you the examples that he's taken, or the emission reduction strategies that he's employed, and how to fill it out over here. Okay, so we're going to start with R1 actions, and you'll notice here that it's 2020 is above, so you'll fill in your 3 actions or your 2 actions or no actions for that year above this date here. Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning of the R1 action. So R1 actions are things you do to reduce your own personal emissions, and Scott Poynton thinks he's been doing this, or started consciously doing this, in 2011 when he bought an electric car. So what we do is we fill in each of these with an action, or one of these with an action, depending on how many you do. So electric car goes there. And we estimate using Project Drawdown that this reduces his emissions by around 1.5 tons per year. Okay? And you'll see it starts editing your graph, all kinds of things like that. But we'll get to that right at the end. So he keeps this electric car until 2013. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to grab it over here, or grab these 2 cells, sorry, and copy it in until we get to 2013. There you go. So those are the only things he did from 2011 to 2013. He had an electric car. That was his own conscious reduction of emissions. So in 2014 he got rid of the electric car, but he became vegan, which is one of the biggest things you can do to actually reduce your own emissions, which, well, according to our findings, actually reduces your emissions by up to 70%. So living in Switzerland, that would be a 3.6 ton reduction. On top of that, he started to consciously drive less. He didn't have an electric car, so he thought with his petrol car he would drive less, and he did this by starting to work from home more, and so on. And we estimate that actually reduces his emissions by around a ton a year. Okay, and the same goes until, we'll say, for the next year the same goes, and he continues doing these things actually all the way to the present day. So I'm going to copy them all the way up until we get to 2020. Okay, and also what we need to add is in 2016 he started to fly less. He changed his job and he's not having to fly as much around the world, which actually has quite a large impact on your carbon. So flying less, we'll say less flights, we're going to say it reduces his emissions by around 0.5. Now, it could be more depending on how much he was flying before, but this is we're trying to underestimate how much it's actually changed, so that we don't overestimate how much he's reduced his emissions by. Okay, so he's continued doing that until the present day. So that's the extent of his R1 actions here, and you'll see it starts to add up a total of how much he's actually reduced in terms of R1. Okay, so that's nearly 40 tons that he would have emitted without having taken these actions. Okay, Now, our two actions are basically part of his global contribution. It doesn't actually affect his own carbon balance, but it's part of what he's doing to help people who can't actually invest in this emissions reduction. So what he did starting in 2016 is he invested in girls' education through Kiva. Okay, girls' ed, and then we're going to say he spent 400 Swiss francs per year on this. And he's been doing this ever since, and he's been spending the same amount each year using kiva.org. So actually, investing in girls' education is one of the major things you can do to reduce emissions elsewhere. For every $100 you spend, you can reduce about 10 tons of carbon. Okay? And now he's continued doing that until today. So we'll copy these up as we did with the R1 actions. So that's the extent of his R2 actions so far. Now, R3 actions are what we do to reduce or remove carbon from the atmosphere. So we're trying to get rid of the carbon that we've previously emitted throughout our whole life in an aim to get to real carbon zero, which is where you have zero carbon emissions basically throughout your whole life by removal of carbon from the atmosphere. So R3 actions, he's invested in various projects which become part of his carbon investment portfolio, which we've talked about in various videos. And he began this by investing in Trillion Trees in a tree planting project in 2017. So we're going to put that in. And he invested what was around 1,400 Swiss francs in Trillion Trees, which led to the planting of 560 trees and 80 tons of carbon over 50 years. Okay? And the next thing he did was invest in Husk, which is a biochar carbon sequestration project, which is on our website. And he invested a total of 1,100 CHF, or Swiss francs, in Husk, which led to the direct removal of 36 tons of carbon within the same year. Okay? And so that's the extent of his assets in terms of carbon. And over here, then we get to the final conclusions. And then this should help you direct your future reductions, your future removals, understand how much you need to invest in your carbon investment portfolio, and so on. So we've gone through the hard parts of the carbon the carbon balance sheet here. And now it spits out basically our answers and what we need to do. Okay, so over here on the right, we've got the final numbers, and we've got a graph underneath. I'll start with the numbers. So these are fairly self-explanatory. How much Scott has reduced in terms of his R1 actions. R2 actions are what he's reduced elsewhere. It doesn't actually affect his personal carbon balance, but it affects the global carbon balance. So that's 200 tons of carbon, which is quite impressive considering his total carbon emissions for his life are 731 down here. Okay, now his total removal by R3 is 116. And as I said before, he spent 1,400 on Trillion Trees and 1,100 on Husk over here. And that's where we get this figure down here, the approximate investment required to remove this remaining tonnage of carbon. So he's reduced his emissions now year on year. So he's not emitting very much, as we'll come to see down the graph. But this is how much is left over. This is how much from his lifetime is still in the atmosphere. And to get to net carbon zero, which is the whole point of My Carbon Zero, he needs to invest in these R3 projects over here, such as Husk and Trillion Trees. And what we've done here, so to get rid of this 576 tons of carbon remaining, this is the approximate investment needed. And this number is based on a balanced portfolio of carbon investments to manage the risk and so on. This is, a mix of long-term and short-term projects and the cost for carbon credits for each of those effectively. And this obviously, it seems like a large number, of course, but year on year, it doesn't actually end up being that much. To get to a net zero point in your life is really the aim for this. It works for individuals as well as businesses, but that is the aim, okay? And on this graph down here, it shows your lifetime emissions. So you can see these large fluctuations, and these are based on the running total and the net emissions. And that's because he's moving from places with very low emissions, such as Vietnam down here, or the UK over here, and then places with very high emissions, such as Australia. Okay, and this is how much his emissions would continue to be without his R1 reductions, over here, this red line. And as you can see, his running total and his net emissions are actually going down due to these changes he's made in his lifestyle to reduce his emissions. So I hope this was helpful. This is how to create your own carbon balance sheet. If you have any more questions or concerns regarding this, please let us know, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And good luck making this yourself. If you have trouble, come to us and we can always help you. And Deluxe members get this made for them. Okay? I look forward to speaking to you in the next tutorial. Thank you.